and a half, the United States pursued a dual-track approach with Beijing. One track involved annual high-level dialogues between U.S. and Chinese officials over 3 successive presidential administrations. These talks were intended to push China towards complying with and internalizing WTO rules and norms and making other market-oriented changes. But those commitments became more difficult to secure over the years, and China's follow-through was inconsistent and impossible to enforce. The other track focused on dispute settlement cases at the WTO. We brought 27 cases against China, including some I litigated myself and through collaboration with our allies. We secured victories in every case that was decided. Still, even when China changed the specific practices we challenged, it did not change the underlying policies, and meaningful reforms by China remained elusive. In recent years, China's leaders have doubled down on their state-centric economic model. Faced with reality that neither the dialogue nor the enforcement tracks were producing meaningful changes, the previous administration decided to use a different paradigm, unilateral U.S. pressure, to try to change Beijing's practices. It launched an investigation focused on China's forced IP and technology transfer policies, long-standing and serious problems. This led to substantial U.S. tariffs on imports from China and retaliation by China. Against this backdrop of rising tensions, in January 2020, the previous administration in China agreed to what is commonly referred to as the Phase 1 agreement. This agreement includes a limited set of commitments. These cover China's obligations regarding intellectual property and technology transfer, purchases of American products, and improved market access for the agriculture and financial services sectors. It has stabilized the market, especially for U.S. agricultural exports. But our analysis indicates that while commitments in certain areas have been met, that certain business interests have seen benefits, there have also been shortfalls in others. But the reality is, this agreement did not meaningfully address the fundamental concerns that we have with China's trade practices and their harmful impacts on the U.S. economy. Even with the Phase 1 agreement in place, China's government continues to pour billions of dollars into targeted industries and continues to shape its economy to the will of the state, hurting the interests of workers here in the U.S. and around the world. Let's look at the steel industry. In 2000, there were more than 100 U.S. steel companies. We produced 100 million metric tons of steel annually, and the industry employed 136,000 people in communities across the country. Soon after, China started building its own steel plants. Its production capacity ballooned, depriving U.S. steel companies of valuable market opportunities. Low-priced Chinese steel flooded the global market, driving out businesses in the United States and around the world. Every steel plant that shuttered left hundreds of workers without livelihoods. It also left communities reeling, as small businesses dependent on plants also closed their doors, and blighted buildings brought down real estate values. Today, China produces over 1 billion metric tons annually and accounts for nearly 60% of global steel production. China produces more steel in a single month than the United States and most other countries in the world produce in an entire year. In the U.S., employment in the steel industry has dropped 40% since 2000. We see the impact of China's unfair policies in the production of photovoltaic solar cells. The United States was once a global leader in what was then an emerging industry. But as China built out its own industry, our companies were forced to close their doors. Today, China represents 80% of global production, and large parts of the solar supply chain don't even exist in the United States. U.S. agriculture has not been spared either. While we have seen more exports to China in recent years, market share is shrinking, and agriculture remains an unpredictable sector for U.S. farmers and ranchers who have come to rely heavily on this market. China's regulatory authorities continue to deploy measures that limit or threaten the market access for our producers and their bottom line. We also see troubling dynamics playing out today with the semiconductor industry. In 2014, China issued an industrial plan to announce the goal of establishing a world-leading semiconductor industry by 2030. Reportedly, China has already spent at least $150 billion on this effort, with more on the way. Its intentions are clear, just as they were with steel and solar. These policies have reinforced a zero-sum dynamic in the world economy, where China's growth and prosperity come at the expense of workers and economic opportunity here in the U.S. and other market-based democratic economies. And that is why we need to take a new, holistic, and pragmatic approach in our relationship with China that can actually further our strategic and economic objectives for the near term and the long term. As our economic relationship with China evolves, so too must our tactics to defend our interests. As the years go by, the stakes keep getting higher, and boosting American competitiveness becomes all the more important. Our strategy must address these concerns while also being flexible and agile to confront future challenges from China that may arise. So how do we accomplish this? Unlike the past, this administration will engage from a position of strength because we are investing in our workers and our infrastructure. Repairing our roads and bridges, modernizing our ports, and delivering expanded broadband are the kinds of investments that will begin to give American workers and businesses the boost needed to embrace their global competitiveness. And we must harness and leverage the talent of our people by investing in education and worker training, investments that are included in the President's Build Back Better plan. We also need to redouble our own efforts to be the most innovative country in the world by researching, developing, and creating new and emerging technology. China and other countries have been investing in their infrastructure for decades. If we are going to compete in the global market, we need to make equal or greater investments here at home. That continuous investment ensures we can maintain our competitive edge throughout the 21st century. Beyond our domestic investments, in the coming days, I intend to have frank conversations with my counterpart in China. That will include discussion over China's performance under the Phase 1 agreement, and we will also directly engage with China on its industrial policies. Our objective is not to inflame trade tensions with China. Durable coexistence requires accountability and respect for the enormous consequences of our actions. I am committed to working through the many challenges ahead in this bilateral process in order to deliver meaningful results. But above all else, we must defend to the hilt our economic interests. And that means taking all steps necessary to protect ourselves against the waves of damage inflicted over the years through unfair competition. We need to be prepared to deploy all tools and explore the development of new ones, including through collaboration with other economies and countries. And we must chart a new course to change the trajectory of our bilateral trade dynamic. And vitally, we will work closely with our allies and like-minded partners towards building truly fair international trade that enables healthy competition. I have been working to strengthen our alliances through bilateral, regional, and multilateral engagement, and I will continue to do so. The agreements we reached in June with the EU and the UK to resolve the large civil aircraft disputes at the WTO demonstrate President Biden's commitment to work with our partners to create a more level playing field for our workers. Just last week, I co-chaired the first meeting of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. As Europe strengthens its own defenses against non-market practices, we will work with them to ensure that our collective policies deliver. In the G7, G20, and at the WTO, we are discussing market distortions and other unfair trade practices, such as the use of forced labor in the fishery sector and in global supply chains, including Xinjiang. In the coming months and years, we will build off of this work. Our goal is to bring deliberative, stable, long-term thinking to our approach and to work through bilateral and multilateral channels. The core of our strategy is a commitment to ensuring we work with our allies to create fair and open markets. There is a future in which all of us in the global economy can grow and succeed, where prosperity is inclusive within our own borders and across those borders too. The path we have been on did not take us there. President Biden's priorities that I've laid out today are aimed at achieving a shared prosperity that is good for our workers, producers, and businesses, good for our allies, and good for the global economy. Thank you.
Well, welcome, Katherine. It's a pleasure to have you here. Let me also welcome Sarah Bianchi, newly sworn-in Deputy USTR, whose, I think, first official act is here. And it's a great honor to have you with us, and I hope to get you back on, in your own right subsequently, probably to talk more about this since China is your portfolio. And thank you to the live audience for coming, and also for those of you that are watching remotely. Katherine and I are going to have a conversation for a little while, and then we're going to take some questions from the live audience as well as questions from the online audience if they have any. And I should alert everybody that she has a firm stop at 11 because you have to go to Paris, I guess. Is that right? For an OECD meeting, and we don't want to get in the way of that. So we'll be stopping on time. Let me begin with kind of the overriding question, I think, based on what you said, which, you alluded to Trump's efforts to try to force China to change its economic policies that were unilateral, and which you characterized as failed, which I think most people would agree to. I guess the fundamental question is it possible to succeed? Can China be changed? Or are we just going to spend the next decade trying to do the impossible?
Well, Bill, let me, thank you very much. Let me just back up one moment. I don't think it's fair to say that I've characterized the previous administration's efforts as failed. What I would say is that it hasn't gotten us to where we need to go. And so that brings me to, I think, the main thrust of your question, which is how do we know that this is the path to get us there? I think, like with anything else in life, you've got to look at where you've come from to figure out, if you've not gotten to where you want to go, how you correct course. And I think that in terms of the approach that the Biden administration is taking, it is very much about being thoughtful, examining what we have done in the past, what it has accomplished, what it has not accomplished, and having that inform how we adjust and look for ways to be more effective, and look to building out a strategy that addresses not just near term, but the long term.
Well, I think part of it is Build Back Better, as you pointed out in detail, and I think that I at least think that makes a lot of sense. It's the running faster part of the strategy. Let's focus on the other part of the strategy, which is how we deal with what they're doing, which is what most of your comments about. So you're saying that that you think that further discussions with the Chinese, I don't want to say negotiations because you didn't use that word, but further discussions with the Chinese might actually produce some change in their policies?
Well, I think that China is a participant in the global economy, and it is the one that we have unresolved issues with. I don't think there is a path to addressing those issues without having a direct conversation with China and direct communication with China.
But it sounds like the main thing you're going to be talking about is how to enforce what Trump negotiated, right?
So that is the starting point, because that is the structure and that is the architecture of the trade relationship that we have right now. But you have to start somewhere if you want to get somewhere else.
Yeah, but after you do that, what's the next thing?
Well, it will depend on how the conversation goes. What I've said in my speech is we will engage on phase one, examine China's performance, have that full conversation with China, while raising our concerns about the larger industrial policy mismatch and the impacts on our economies.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about where they are on phase one? Do you buy the Chad Bones scorekeeping on that? Your predecessor did not. Do you think he's right about where they are? How far along are they? Can they meet the goals this year? Is that possible?
So no disrespect to Chad Bone, but I haven't seen his scorecard, so can't comment on it. But let me just say this. The phase one agreement has a lot of parts to it. The part that attracts the most attention is the purchase commitments, because there are numbers and metrics that are naturally involved. There's trade data that's publicly available here in the US and Chinese trade data. We are all looking at the same data. I think that the questions are going to be in the conversations with China in the performance and maintenance of this phase one agreement, which is useful and has had value in stabilizing the relationship. How can we address the concerns that we have around China's performance?
Are there particular points you want to, things they have not done that you want to focus on?
I think that the question is, there are things that appear that they have not done.
I
have not had the conversation with them around whether they have tried to do it or what's come, what the intervening concerns are. So let me put it this way. I think that we are going to have and have to have really honest conversations with China about all of the elements of the phase one agreement. These are commitments that China made. They are commitments that our businesses and workers in certain sectors have looked to. We will have to address where this relationship goes from this starting point.
I have to say, in passing, about 4 months ago, I did a little project trying to figure out where they had met their commitments and where they had not. And I discovered that nobody at USTR wanted to tell me. I mean, I gathered that somebody was keeping score somewhere, but nobody was talking. Are you going to make that public at some point?
Well, I like to pride myself in, with the current team that I have and carrying out President Biden's spirit that we have brought a new level of transparency to USTR. But you know, in terms of these analyses, it's not the type of thing that USTR likes to put out there. I would say this: I think that our assessment is something, most importantly, that we have to take up with China, and that's why these conversations are so important.
And okay, let me ask. Move on to something else slightly. There have been rumors that you're going to initiate a new Section 301 investigation. Are you?
It depends. I have all kinds of tools available to us. You know more than most people about the 1974 Act and Section 301.
I recall it, yes. The person who wrote it is a good friend of mine, so yes.
So Section 301 is a trade enforcement tool. It is a very, very important tool. We will look at all available tools in addressing our concerns and ensuring that we are able to defend the interests of the American economy.
As a legal matter, if you want to make changes in the tariffs that the President has imposed pursuant to 301, not exclusions, but material changes in the tariffs, wouldn't you have to initiate a new investigation at this point?
I'll defer to my lawyers on the ins and outs
you're
of
one
Section
of them.
301. But I'm not my own lawyer.
Well, and they say that he who represents himself has a fool for a client, so I can't complain about that. But okay, I understand that, or I'm told actually, that phase one, among other things, included targets for Chinese purchases 2022 through 2025. Are you going to continue those? Are you going to hold them to those? It sounds like you're not going to do phase two. That would phase two. What happens after phase one as far as purchasing is concerned? Are they on their own at that point?
So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour and just express my own personal disinclination for the term phase one agreement. The actual name of the agreement is the U.S.-China Trade and Economic Agreement, I believe, but it's kind of a mouthful. So phase one it is. I'm not quite sure. You'll have to ask my predecessor and the previous administration in setting this up as phase one, what they were thinking about as a phase two. So, you know, there's an expectations issue there. But let me just say this. I think that the structure, the architecture of this agreement is where we have to start. And in terms of how we proceed from here is going to involve the principles that I've just laid out in my speech around what will be in the interests of the American economy, our workers, our businesses, our producers, and how much traction we get with China, and to what degree we have to take our own measures to defend our interests.
Okay, I guess the question would be, I guess I'm not supposed to use phase one, but the current commitments expire at the, as far as purchases are concerned at the end of the calendar year. The agreement expires I guess in Valentine's Day, as I recall, or thereabouts. So that means really after this year, they don't have any obligations to purchase, to buy anything from us, right?
Well, I think you referenced that there are there's language on further years
yes.
in the agreement, but it's not as specific as these past 2 years. As I'm looking at this agreement, not having been a part of the negotiating team, I think what that says to me is that further conversations have to happen between the two sides to provide for care and maintenance for this relationship.
Well, with respect to those conversations, can you be a little more specific other than saying soon? You got any plans?
We are working on plans, I can tell you that.
Okay, well, that's good. You had also mentioned, as the President on several occasions, about working together with partners and allies and how important that is, which I think everyone here would agree to. Can you say a little bit more about which partners and allies in particular you've been working with on China?
Well, again, referencing the new level of transparency and openness that we have at USTR, for those of you who have signed up for our readouts and press statements, I think that we generate quite a lot of inbox activity. Almost every conversation that I have with a foreign counterpart, I am looking to explore where our shared interests are. To your specific question on who we've been working with on China, I think that this has been out in the open this entire time. And is actually maybe the least anticipated part of the discussion around our strategy. If you look at the settlement of the large civil aircraft disputes earlier this year in June with the UK and the EU, that was about finding a way to manage our own differences between us and converting a relationship of litigation into one of collaboration on shared challenges. And in that sector, the shared challenge certainly coming from Chinese industrial policies.
Well, the next one up is steel and aluminum. Is that going to get in the way of cooperation with the EU on China?
I don't think so. I think that with respect to steel and aluminum and the work that USTR has been doing with the Department of Commerce, the engagement with the EU follows the same line of thinking and spirit as the approach that we took to large civil aircraft, which is how do you take a situation of tension and work through it to convert it into a partnership and collaboration. And that is certainly what we are working on in our goal in that exercise.
Is increasing market access to China one of your goals? And if so, what sectors are you targeting?
I think that part of the story of the U.S.-China trade relationship over these recent few decades has been about this thirst on the part of our business sector in particular for increased market access to China. And business sector, I include our agricultural sector, obviously. You know, I think along the traditional lines of the way we've thought about trade and how benefits come from trade, it has been very focused on securing market access. I think that what we've seen is our traditional approach to trade has run into a lot of realities that are today causing us to open our eyes and think about, is what we're looking for more liberalized trade and just more trade? Or are we looking for smarter and more resilient trade?
That's sort of a very elegant no.
Well, Bill, I think that is up for interpretation.
Okay, well, that's my interpretation. We'll see. I think that I've had other conversations like this, and I end up always remembering that there are people actually that want to sell more stuff out there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And we're for that,
there
right?
are people who are selling a lot of stuff, yes. So, you know, this is a good clarification to make, which is in the U.S.-China trade relationship, there have been sectors that have done quite well. What we are seeking to do is to ensure that if there are things that are working, they should continue to work. But in terms of China's scale, the direction of its industrial policies in particular, and in terms of the speed with which we've seen China accomplish many of its goals, there are a number of sectors and areas in our economy where we can no longer just wish for the best. We've actually got to do something and address it.
Is decoupling of supply chains with China a Biden administration priority?
I know there's a lot of talk about decoupling. I think at the end of the day, I still don't have necessarily good understanding of what everybody means if we've got a common definition of decoupling. I think that the concern, maybe the question, is whether or not the United States and China need to stop trading with each other. I don't think that's a realistic outcome in terms of our global economy. I think that the issue perhaps is what are the goals we're looking for in a kind of recoupling? How can we have a trade relationship with China where we are occupying strong and robust positions within the supply chain, and that there is a trade that's happening as opposed to a dependency?
Well, related to decoupling is the question of, and this is sort of related to Build Back Better, because a good bit of Build Back Better seems to be about reshoring, not just with respect to China, but bringing jobs back to the United States. Do you think that Made in America laws or Buy American laws are sufficient leverage to localize sourcing of goods currently made in China?
Bill, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if anybody does, but I'm glad you asked this question because it gives me an opportunity to talk a bit about this notion of revitalizing our manufacturing base. I think that in a lot of people's minds, manufacturing is something that comes from an earlier era, that it's something that if we lose it over time, it's okay. I think what a lot of people don't appreciate is that manufacturing, the act of making things, first of all, is critical to our resilience as an economy. And I'll just point to the COVID-19 pandemic that we continue to struggle through, and that scramble for basic goods like masks, gloves, gowns, even ventilators in the early months of the pandemic for us. With a critical level of manufacturing activity, an economy has more adaptability and pivotability than without, first of all. Second of all, I don't think enough people appreciate the degree to which manufacturing activity is a vital part of the innovation ecosystem. We talk a lot about research and development, but if you're just doing research and development and you're not also in the process of translating that into the actual doing and making, you have left out of the cycle a very important feedback loop in terms of how you can continue to make your processes better, how you can make your designs better. And that is something, if we want to be a leader and we want to maintain our status as the world's innovation hotbed, that manufacturing activity is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I used to give speeches about that. You know, if you don't make anything, eventually you don't invent anything. You can use that line if you want.
I like it. I will.
It's. I think it's true,
Yeah.
but the question really is about how you get there. And a lot of what the administration is proposing is in the incentives category. Let's restore our innovative capabilities, and we've already talked about that. That's not the controversial part. The controversial part is, what are we going to do about companies that have embedded other imports into their supply chains, and what are we going to do about pushing them to not do that anymore?
Well, I think that still is about incentives. I think that, at least with respect to what we do in trade, the rules that we have in our system don't go out there and make things happen. In general, they're just setting up a structure within which our economic participants make their own decisions. And I think that it is actually critical to be looking at the incentive structure to incentivize resilience, as opposed to just efficiency. Okay,
let me do one or two more, and then we're going to go to the audience. This one is the obvious, which is U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, which coincides with China's application to join the CPTPP. What is the administration going to do about that? Are we planning to join CPTPP? Are you getting warmer to the idea? Are you going to try to block China's joining the CPTPP?
So when you say U.S. engagement coincides with China's application, China just applied a week or two ago. The United States has been engaged, has been deeply invested in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific for a very long time. You know, what I would say is we care deeply about the partners in that region of the world, in particular because I think that competitive pressures on them are, because of geography, particularly acute. In terms of CPTPP, I guess I would say this. The TPP, which is the basis for the CPTPP, was something that was negotiated several years ago now. It concluded, I think, 6 years ago, almost exactly. And the world economy has shown us realities in the intervening years that I think we really have to pay attention to. So, you know, in terms of our continued investment and engagement with our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific, I think what we need to do is to fully engage and address the realities and challenges that we see today.
Okay, I have an opinion about that, but I'll save it for the podcast. Tune in later on for our next podcast. Let's go to the audience. Scott Kennedy, I think you have a question. I saw a hand up. Wait for the microphone, and please tell us who you are before you ask your question.
Ambassador Tai, thanks so much for being here. It's great to have you at CSIS to unveil your bilateral China policy. I wanted to ask about the phase one, sorry for using that term, about the U.S.-China trade agreement from January 2020. It sounds like from what you described that it may not be your first choice, but given where we've come from, you're comfortable enough with employing the strategy or approach of managed trade that you're not about to abandon it. So I was curious your thoughts about sort of conceptually managed trades, government setting targets and trying to achieve them. With regard to the deal itself, are you going to formally invoke the appeals process that's laid out in Chapter 7 of the agreement to launch these conversations with the Chinese? And who is your counterpart in China? Is that Liu He, or just curious who we expect to have on the other side of the table? Thanks.
So, Scott, if I'm not mistaken, you're the other half of the Trade Guys podcast, yes?
Unfortunately, Scott Miller.
No,
Oh, that's Scott
another
Miller.
Scott.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
We're not double teaming.
Understood. I think you might have asked me 3 or 4 questions. So if I could exercise the privilege, could you just kind of highlight for me the ones that you really want me to respond to?
Just your thoughts about managed trade and then the appeals process.
Okay. Let's see. I guess managed trade is one way you could describe the purchase commitments. What are my views on it? I'm a tremendously practical person. There are commitments that have been made. That means that there are commitments that we have to seek follow through on. I think that when you talk about managed trade, just to break it down, it is a different model for managing a trade relationship than the model that we've pursued before, which has been, let's seek market access and then, let the chips fall where they may. I guess what I would say is, channeling my inner pragmatism, this is the arrangement that we have now. It is an arrangement that has evolved out of a frustration with the previous model. And so the question that I bring to this issue that you've presented is not ideologically how do I feel about it, but what is actually going to present results and what is actually going to be effective. And I think that this conversation around the purchase commitments that we are preparing to have is going to be directly informative to determining how effective this is at this point in time for the challenges that we have in this relationship.
Okay, John Verno.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. Thank you for your remarks today. I wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit about the exclusion process that you envision, not asking you to go into great detail. That will be forthcoming as appropriate. But just as you know, a lot of U.S. companies, downstream manufacturers, use inputs from China, would be quite happy to source from countries from either domestically or other countries, but have had trouble getting those other sources. So I'm just curious as to what weight you expect you would place on requesters of these exclusions when they say they just cannot source this domestically or from other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's great to see you, and thank you for that extremely important question. I guess what I would say is we place a lot of weight in what we hear from our businesses, especially our small and medium-sized businesses that certainly have been impacted by the tariffs, and that is why, that is certainly why we are restarting a tariff exclusion process.
Okay, they're on two over from Scott. I can't.
Thank you, Bill. Dan Rosen from Rhodium Group. You said just a second ago that commitments were made and therefore they must be followed through. A lot of commitments were made in the Trump years. I wonder if that applies to all of them. But with regard to the phase one in particular, 100% of China's purchase commitments could be fulfilled by trade diversion from our allies. Take, for example, barley, which the Chinese canceled contracts with the Australians, moved those contracts over to the United States. I'm trying to reconcile the focus on working with allies with the centrality of the so-called phase one agreement at the heart of your approach.
So let me try to formulate what I heard in your question, and you can let me know if I've missed something, which is how do you work with your allies at the same time as you raise concerns around purchase commitments with China because the allies are impacted by those commitments and may not like those commitments? Is that essentially your question?
Well, the question is that the phase one is inherently a bilateral agreement that has no regard for the multilateral consequences of how those Chinese commitments are fulfilled. So is that compatible with the focus you have on making sure we start with allies among market economies, or is there potentially a technical problem?
Well, let's take 2 steps back from the phase one agreement. The phase one agreement wasn't concocted in a vacuum, right? And I go through the the sequence of events in the speech that I just gave, which is there was a 301 investigation. The 301 investigation led to several tranches of tariffs, which led to retaliation from China, which then led to this engagement and the negotiation of this agreement. So this agreement comes about in the midst of increased tensions and trade actions between our two economies. As I see it, the commitments that have come out of the Phase 1 agreement operated, one, to stabilize these rising tensions, but also to address, or to attempt to address, this need to realign the relationship. It is important, and it is an important question, which I think Scott asked earlier, which is whether or not this structure that we have is effective in addressing the interests that we have as an economy vis-a-vis the relationship we have with China. And I think that is the critical question, and that is the one that we are going to have to assess in our conversations with China and with our allies.
Okay, last row back there. Yeah.
On the Denny Galino from Mace News, on the outside chance that perhaps China would increase its purchases and somehow meet its commitments under Phase 1, would the U.S. then reciprocate and do something equally nice?
Would we reciprocate? Let me say this. I know why everyone is fixated on the purchase commitments. But let me just say this. I think that the real essence of the engagement and these first steps in terms of resuming the bilateral contact with China is assessing and establishing the bases for this relationship, how we navigate it in the near term, and where we can take it in the longer term. So I'm just going to, kind of create a little bit of distance with respect to your particular hypothetical, because I think that there are a lot of additional elements to these conversations that are coming up that are as important, if not more important, than the specific issue of purchase commitments.
Okay, Meredith. Wait for the microphone. Long wait, sorry.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai. This question relates to the Digital Markets Act. It would crack in the European Union. It would crack down on a lot of U.S. tech firms that are operating there through large-scale changes to their competition policy law. The DMA raises lots of WTO issues, including broad-scale discrimination of U.S. firms. Secretary Raimondo said yesterday or last week that she was going to express her reservations about the DMA to the Europeans at the Trade and Technology Council. Can you give us some insight into how the DMA was discussed with the Europeans at the TTC last week?
Well, thank you, Meredith, for that question. I can confirm that it was discussed. And let me just reflect on, your question in the context of the other questions that I've had today, and just observe how really complex the entire world economy is. And the degree to which, our economic activity, our economic interactions are very complex, but also how they are impacted by the development of technology and the way that technology is changing the way we interact with our economy and with each other in different economies. So I particularly appreciate you asking that question in the context of this session, because I think it does go to how important it is to defend the interests of our economy, our workers, and our businesses with countries with whom we think we have a lot in common and countries with whom we have a lot of tension. So, to your specific question, I think I just confirmed that the issue was raised and that I am very confident that those of us on the administration team will continue to raise our concerns and ask questions with the Europeans. And because of the TTC, I am confident that we will be able to address these concerns and have the kind of robust and honest conversations with the Europeans that we need to have.
Okay, in the back, the gentleman with the white mask next to the camera. I'm sorry, with masks I can't recognize anybody anymore.
It's Peter Rashford from AICGS, Johns Hopkins. Ambassador Tai, you mentioned the importance of working with allies and like-minded countries. Do you think that a plurilateral agreement, perhaps starting with US, EU, and Japan, that aimed at higher standards and stricter enforcement on subsidies and state-owned enterprises could help create leverage that would encourage China to mitigate any aspects of its economic behavior that is harmful to US workers and firms?
So I like that question also because, it intersects a couple of the themes and principles that I laid out in the speech. One of them is working with allies, right, collaboration. And the other piece of it is the use of tools, right, and looking for how we can be effective. I always want to make clear that we will look at all available tools, we will look at developing new tools, and we will look at all of these elements through the lens of where there is opportunity to work with others. So the specific example is a potential opportunity to work with our allies and to develop new tools and new rules, but I'm particularly interested in new tools because the key is how can we be effective in changing the trajectory of this global competition model, and how we can do that with others.
Okay, I think the person next to Peter had a question too. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Tai. This is Mary Lovely from the Peterson Institute. You mentioned that you wanted to change the dynamic of the relationship, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that. In particular, right now we have a scatter approach with the tariffs. For example, we have tariffs on footwear. When we talk about industrial subsidies, we're really talking about the industries of the future, and so that suggests a pivot in focus in your office. And I'm just wondering if you might speak to how you see us moving from where we are today to a focus on industrial subsidies and what tools you might use. Thank you.
So I have to confess I didn't quite understand the pivot, but I think that you mean you heard in the speech a focus on both trade and goods, but then also focus on trade and technology. Does that capture it? I think of it this way. As U.S. Trade Representative, right, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, our job is to represent the interests of the U.S. economy and trade. That's the entire economy, and that is also the entire range of trade. So, I don't see it as much as a pivot, but when we talk about bringing a holistic approach to how we're looking at U.S.-China trade and, more broadly, our worker-centered trade policy, it is about looking at the comprehensive picture.
Well, we have a couple online questions, which I think you can dispose of fairly quickly, and then we'll finish on time.
Okay.
Does the administration have a plan to discuss Chinese foreign exchange policies going forward?
Oh, well, so foreign exchange is primarily the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department.
I knew you were going to say that, but I didn't want to stiff the online questioner, but okay. Another a macroeconomic question. With inflation a real concern in the U.S. right now, isn't there pressure to remove tariffs where possible, if only to relieve price pressures that risk broader macroeconomic consequences?
Well, on this one, I would say that inflation is a concern worldwide, and that it has a lot to do as well with this is my economic term. It has a lot to do with the discombobulation in supply chains that come with the global pandemic. Both the lockdown from the pandemic and also this recovery process, we see mismatches in demand and supply and disruptions in supply chain. So yes, inflation is something that everyone is looking at carefully, and I think that on this you also have to look holistically.
Okay, one more, because I forgot to ask it, and it's embarrassing that I forgot. What role does the WTO play in all this?
Oh, well.
On China in particular.
Sure, on China in particular. Well, let me say this about the WTO, and I really want to take this opportunity because I say it to a lot of counterparts and a lot of audiences that are smaller perhaps than the one we have today, and I want to take the opportunity to make this clear in this context also. We at USTR and this administration support the WTO. We were founders of the WTO. We were there at the beginning. We were founders of the GATT that came before the WTO. The WTO absolutely has a very, very important role to play here. But as you've also heard in my narration of the course of events in the development of the U.S.-China trade relationship, we focused very heavily on the WTO, certainly in the first 15 years of China's membership at the WTO. And I think that as much as we will continue to invest and commit and try to innovate in terms of being a member at the WTO and seeking to bring reform to the WTO, that we also need to be agile and to be open-minded and to think outside of the box with respect to how we can be more effective in addressing the concerns that we really have been struggling to address with China on trade.
Well, we could spend 15 more minutes on that alone. We'll have to have you back to talk about the WTO in greater detail. It's an issue of great interest, I think, here at CSIS and some of the work we do. But this time we're out of time, so thank you very much for coming to visit us. Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you to the audience for some very thoughtful questions as well.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thanks to all of you.